Okay, now we're going to look at how did we get here. We did an entire lesson night on the history of political parties, so we're not going to revisit that. We're just going to look at the role, the specific role of the Southern Democrats in 20th century politics. So, in the 20th century, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party both had conservative factions. There were some Republican congressmen who were more liberal than some Democratic congressmen, and vice versa. Republicans on the whole were more conservative, and Democrats on the whole were more liberal. But there was an ideological spectrum, and there were people kind of in the middle on both sides. In 1959, the issue was such that the American Political Science in 1950, the American Political Science Association, which is like the association of political science professors, made a formal recommendation that the parties needed to become more ideologically aligned, that the Republicans needed to have all of the conservatives and the Democrats needed to have all of the liberals, and that would actually help us solve our problems. In retrospect, that looks like a very foolish recommendation because that's essentially what's happened and got us to this place. Um, but it does make the job of political scientists easier when you can sort things into nice, neat categories rather than kind of the messy system that we had. Southern Democrats were among the most conservative voters and elected officials in the 20th century. For historical reasons, i.e., the Civil War, they were members of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party nationally moved to the left, but Southern Democrats were did not move with the party. And so what happened? Why do we have Southern Democrats stay Democrats, but not kind of be in tune with the ideology of the other 38 states? And there is actually scientific research, this political science research that showed that all of this began to change with air conditioning. And so, it's bizarre research, but it's borne out time after time after time. What ended up happening was that in prior to air conditioning's wide implementation, the South was just not considered a place that was livable by most people. It was way too hot, way too humid, and the summers were way too awful. And what when air conditioning came in, meant that people were more amenable to moving to the South. And when they moved to the South, they brought their politics, which were no longer shaped by this by Civil War ideologies. And so a Republican would move to town, like the middleman at the car dealership or something, and he would say he was a Republican, and initially people would go, "Oh my goodness, what is that? You must be a terrible person. You belong to the party of Lincoln." And then they start talking about issues and realize they are actually on the same page. And so that kind of loosened up the idea that in order to be a good Christian, you had to be a Democrat. Now it's almost the other way around. Um, and then political leaders saw an advantage in kind of, or especially Republican political leaders saw an advantage of there's this huge block of conservatives who are voting Democratic. Maybe we can peel them off and win elections. Okay, so when you look back to the early history, the Civil War was really determinative in Southern politics. I mean, last week, in the middle of a national or an international pandemic that is overwhelming hospital systems and social service, the governor of Mississippi took time to declare a day of Confederate remembrance or some such thing like that. The Civil War is still going on in the South. And Democrats in the Civil War were the party of the Confederacy. Republicans were the party of emancipation. And so, if you were a traditional Southerner, you were a Democrat. During the Great Depression, there's a little bit of weakening of this. Um, in the Civil War, after immediately after the Civil War and Reconstruction, emancipated slaves moved kind of in mass to the Republican Party because I mean it was Lincoln's party, it was the party of emancipation. During the Great Depression, blacks began to question whether or not that alliance was really in their interest, and they started supporting Franklin D. Roosevelt's social policies. I mean, it wasn't a mass movement; it was more of a gradual thing. But even as blacks were moving to the Democratic Party and becoming an important Democratic constituency, FDR needed Southern senators' votes on for the New Deal. And one of the compromises he made was creating New Deal programs in a way that was racially exclusionary. For instance, the Social Security bill only applied to people who worked in formal companies. And so, if you were for perhaps like a maid all of your life, and now you were 70 and very poor and needed relief from the New Deal, you couldn't get it because you weren't part of a traditional company. And that was actually a compromise made to get some Southern Democrats on board. Um, but you do see this real divergence between Southern Democrats and the rest of the Democratic Party. In the civil rights era, as Democrats went all in on civil rights, we start to see some political leverage made of this. So Democrat Strom Thurmond ran for president on the Dixiecrat ticket. It was a new party, and he ended up winning several southern states. So he showed that it was possible for um, um, conservatives to win, conservatives who were not Republicans to win. And so the next step then began getting those people to getting the Southern Democrats to actually be willing to vote for a Republican. And Barry Goldwater in 1964 was the first person to do this. He won 6 states, won his home state of Arizona, and the southern states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. He won 48% of the Southern popular vote, not just in those 5 states, but across the entire 12-state South. Whereas in the nation, if you include the South and everything else, he only won 39%. And along the eastern seaboard, he only won 32%. So he really did tap into something and was able to move um, Southern Democrats to accepting a Republican candidate. This was a signal to Republicans that there was a viable constituency here. Nixon based his entire 1968 campaign on what he called the Southern Strategy, where he explicitly said, "Vote for Nixon for president, and your Democratic senator and representatives for Congress," and he would work with them. He made that promise that a vote for Nixon wasn't a vote for emancipation Republicans, and that you could vote for a Republican for president who would then work with your local Democratic senators. In 1972, when he was running for reelection, there was an organization set up called Nixon's for Democrat, with leading Southern Democrats as urging their support for Nixon, Democratic governors, and Democratic senators, and so on. In 1980, Reagan won the presidency with a new constituency that they called Reagan Democrats. And when we talk about Reagan Democrats, we often see this as the union member, the labor union member in Ohio. But actually, most of the Southern Democrats were in southern states. Most of the Reagan Democrats were in southern states. When his vice president, George Bush Sr., ran for president, um, the Democratic ticket was Michael Dukakis, and he picked Lloyd Bentsen, a Democratic senator from Texas, to be his vice president. Lloyd Bentsen simultaneously ran for re-election to the Senate, so he's running for 2 different races at the same time. And in Texas, there's a popular bumper sticker that said Bush Bentsen '88. Basically, let's elect Bush be president and re-elect Bentsen to the Senate. The the Republican inroads to the South were of sufficient concern that when in 1992, when a Southern Democrat, Bill Clinton, won the primaries, he chose Al Gore, who was not just a Tennessee Democratic senator, but also a member of the a Tennessee Democratic political dynasty. His father and grandfather had been prominent Democratic elected leaders, and so knowing that the Democrats, knowing that they were losing their influence in the South, nominated a president and vice presidential candidate who were both well-known Southern leaders. And even in that case, Republicans still won Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. When Al Gore would go on to run for election in the year 2000, he would lose his home state of Tennessee. And by 2000, the South was lost to um, Republicans. I mean, South was lost to Democrats.